chaperone was a form of hood or, later, highly versatile hat worn in all parts of Western Europe in the Middle Ages. Initially a utilitarian garment, it first grew a long partly decorative tail behind called a liripipe, and then developed into a complex, versatile and expensive headgear after what was originally the vertical opening for the face began to be used as a horizontal opening for the head. It was especially fashionable in mid-15th century Burgundy, before gradually falling out of fashion in the late 15th century and returning to its utilitarian status. It is the most commonly worn male headgear in early Netherlandish painting, but its complicated construction is often misunderstood. Humble origins. The chaperone began before 1200 as a hood with a short cape put on by pulling over the head, or fastening at the front. The hood could be pulled off the head to hang behind, leaving the short cape round the neck and shoulders. The edge of the cape was often trimmed, cut or scalloped for decorative effect. There were wool ones, used in cold weather, and lighter ones for summer. In this form it continued through to the end of the Middle Ages, worn by the lower classes, are often by women as well as men, and especially in Northern Europe. The hood was loose at the back, and sometimes ended in a tail that came to a point. Terms and derivation. Chaperone is a diminutive of chaper, which derives, like the English cap, cape and cope, from the late Latin cappa, which already could mean cap, cape, a hood. The tail of the hood, often quite long, was called the tippet, a liripipe in English, and liripipe a cornet in French. The cape element was a pat in French and in English cape, or sometimes coxcomb when fancily cut. Later a round bourrelet could form part of the assemblage. Pat, cornet and bourrelet were the usual terms in the French of the 15th century Burgundian court, and are used here. In Italian the equivalent terms were foggia, becchetto, and mazzocchio. Chaperone was sometimes used in English, and also German, for both the hood and hat forms, but the word never appears in the Paston letters, where there are many references to hats, hoods and bonnets for men. As with all aspects of medieval costume, there are many contemporary images of clothing, and many mentions of names for clothing in contemporary documents, but definitively matching the names to the styles in the images is rarely possible. In Italian the word was capuccio, or its diminutive cappuccino, from which come the Capuchin friar, whose distinctive white hood and brown robe led to the monkey and the type of coffee being named after them. Little Red Riding Hood is Le Petit Chaperon Rouge in the earliest published version, by Charles Perrault, and French depictions of the story naturally favor the chaperone over the long riding hood of ones in English. In French, chaperone was also the term in falconry for the hood placed over a hawk's head when held on the hand to stop it wanting to fly away. It is either this or the headgear meaning that later extended figuratively to become chaperone, meaning a protective escort, especially for a woman, using the wrong hole. About 1300 the chaperone began to be worn by putting the hole intended for the face over the top of the head instead, perhaps in hot weather. This left the cornet tail and the cape pat hanging loose from the top of the head. This became fashionable, and chaperones began to be made to be worn in this style. Some authorities only use the term chaperone for this type, calling the earlier forms hoods, which was certainly the usual name in English. This is a categorization for modern discussions only. There is no dispute over whether chaperone was a contemporary term. See the wearing collie western ward of the Mandilion for an analogous development in a type of coat. A padded circular bourrelet evolved, which sat around the head, whilst the cornet became much longer, and gradually more scarf-like in shape, until by the 1430s it was usually straight at the sides and square-ended. Especially in Italy, the cornet was sometimes dispensed with, leaving just an unflared tubular pad fixed to the bourrelet all round and hanging down to one side of the head. Reed calls these sack hats. By 1400 to 16, the period of the famous illuminated manuscripts of the Livre de Chasse of Gaston Phoebus, and the Tres Riches du Duc de Berry chaperones are to be seen worn by many figures. In the famous calendar scenes of the Tres Riches, they are worn in the original form by the peasants working in the fields, both men and women and huntsmen, and in the new form by some of the courtiers, who wear coloured and scalloped ones, probably of silk. However, the Duke himself and the most prominent courtiers do not wear them. In the Livre de Chasse they are most often worn by the low huntsman on foot in the original form, though the unmounted hunters also wear them on top of the head. Figures often have a hood chaperon and a hat as well. Interestingly, only the original form is worn by the very highest-ranking figures. By the 1430s most chaperons had become simpler in the treatment of the cloth, and the cornet is long and plain, although the pat may still be elaborately treated with dagging. A perhaps overdressed courtier in a Van der Weyden workshop exhumation of St. Hubert from this decade still has a very elaborately cut and daggered pat. A figure behind him is wearing his in church, which is unusual. Evolved chaperone. By the middle of the 15th century, the evolved chaperone had become common wear for males in the upper and middle classes, and were worn in painted portraits, including those of the Dukes of Burgundy. The amount of cloth involved had become considerable, and although chaperones seem to have normally been of a single color at this period, a silk damask one would have been a conspicuous sign of affluence. A Florentine chaperone of 1515 is recorded as using 16 braccia of cloth, over 10 yards. Chaperones are nearly always shown in art as plain-colored at this period, but painting a patterned one would have been a daunting task. The cornet now stretched nearly to the ground, and the pat had also grown slightly. Both were now plain and undecorated by cutting or dagging at the edges. Burlets could be very large or quite modest. Some were clearly made round a hollow framework. The largest burlets are worn by very high-ranking men around 1445 to 50. Sometimes they seem to be just a ring with an open center, and sometimes the opening seems to be at least partly covered with fixed cloth. Because the burlets were usually the same shape all the way around, several different parts of it could be worn facing forward. Probably for this reason, chaperones are rarely seen adorned by badges or jewelry. There were now many ways of wearing, and indeed carrying, this most complex and adaptable of hats. The cornet and pat could be tied together on top of the head, to create a flamboyant turban-like effect, sometimes with a short tail of cornet or pat hanging to the rear. The pat could be looped under the chin and tied up into the bourrelet on the other side of the face, whilst the cornet hung behind or in front, or was tied on top. The pat could be worn to the rear, with the cornet tied on top, or hanging loose to front or rear. Conversely, the pat could be tied above, whilst the cornet hung loose to front or rear. The pat could be worn to the rear, loose or tucked into the other clothes at the back of the neck, whilst the cornet was wrapped round over the top of the head and under the chin a couple of times and secured. This was suitable for cold or windy weather, especially when riding. When the chaperone needed to be removed in warm weather, or in the presence of a person much higher in rank, it could be put over the shoulder with the pat and cornet hanging on opposite sides, or round the shoulders. Which came forward and which went back varies considerably, but more often the bourrelet went behind. Possibly the chaperone was secured to the shoulder, as the assemblage often looks rather precarious. Donor figures in religious paintings always wear the chaperones in this way, as they are figuratively in the presence of the saints of the Madonna. Examples of these styles are shown in the illustrations to the article and in the gallery section below. The height of fashion. The only surviving manuscript miniature by Rogier van der Weyden shows Philip the Good wearing a chaperone in style B. Next to him stands Chancellor Nicholas Rollin, using a less exuberant version of style B. Only he has sufficient status to wear his chaperone indoors in the Duke's presence. Apart from the Bishop of Tournai, next to Rollin, all the other men are bareheaded, even Philip's young heir, despite the fact that several of them are high-ranking intimates who, like the Duke, wear the collar of the Order of the Golden Fleece. But as far as can be seen, all have hats. The man in grey seems to be carrying another sort of hat, but all the other ones visible are chaperones worn in style F, mostly with the cornets to the front. The young Charles the Bold has his pad wrapped round the back of his neck, and the man on the extreme right has his bourrelet further than usual down his back, with the pat hanging down from it. Most of the chaperones are black, although the man in blue has one in salmon pink. Black was having one of its earliest periods of being the most fashionable color at the time. The chaperone never became quite this dominant in Italy or France, nor does it seem to have been worn as often by grand personages, although this is sometimes the case. There is a famous bust of Lorenzo de' Medici wearing one, although in this he may be deliberately avoiding ostentatious dress. They are more characteristic of merchants and lawyers in these countries, for example in the images of Jean Fouquet from the mid-century. In England, on the other hand, almost all the non-royal members of the Order of the Garter are shown wearing them in the portraits in the Bruges Garter book of 1430 to 1440. In the Holy Roman Empire, Spain and Portugal they were generally less common, and appeared lower down the social scale. They were apparently never worn by the clergy anywhere. Political chaperones. Chaperones were used in France and Burgundy to denote by their color allegiance to a political faction. The factions themselves were also sometimes known as chaperones. During the captivity in England of King John II of France in 1356, the participants in a popular uprising in Paris against his son, the future Charles V, wore party-colored chaperones of red for Paris, and blue for Navarre as they supported the claim to the French throne of King Charles the Bad of Navarre. In 1379 the ever-difficult citizens of Ghent rose up against Duke Philip the Bold of Burgundy wearing white chaperones. White was also worn in factional disturbances in Paris in 1413, by opponents of the Armagnacs, during one of King Charles VI's bouts of madness. The chaperone was one of the items of male clothing that featured in the charges brought against Joan of Arc at her trial in 1431. This was, apparently, a hat rather than a hood, as she was stated to have taken it off in front of the Dauphin. This was cited as further damning evidence of her assuming male behaviors. In 15th-century Florence, capucci were associated with republicans, as opposed to courtiers. An advisor to the Medici told them in 1516 that they should get as many young men to wear the courtier's cap rather than the capucci. Part of the connotation seems to arise because the chaperone was too complicated to be taken off on meeting one of higher rank. It was merely touched or pushed back on the head slightly. The capuccio in Renaissance art, in addition to being featured in many Renaissance portraits by virtue of being the fashion of the day, the Italian capuccio was of interest because the Maasocchio's shape made it a good subject for the developing art of perspective. The painter Paolo Uccello studied the perspective of the Maasocchio and incorporated it in some of his paintings. Apart from portraits, many of the best, and least formal, depictions of the chaperone in art come from paintings of the Nativity and other scenes of the early life of Christ. It is of course always winter when the chaperone was most likely to be worn. St. Joseph is especially useful, as it is never part of his depiction to be fashionably dressed. and it is part of his character in the period that he is often shown quite dishevelled. The shepherds are the lower-class figures most often shown in a large scale in paintings of the period. Decline. By about 1480 the chaperone was ceasing to be fashionable, but continued to be worn. The size of the bourrelet was reduced, and the patin decorated. St. Joseph could, by this stage, often be seen with the evolved form. By 1500 the evolved chaperone was definitely outmoded in Northern Europe, but the original hood form still remained a useful headgear for shepherds and peasants. By this time the evolved chaperone had become fixed in some forms of civilian uniforms for lawyers, academics and the members of some knightly orders. In these uses it gradually shrank in size and often became permanently attached to the clothing underneath, effectively just as an ornament. In Italy it remained more current, more as a dignified form of headgear for older men, until about the 1520s. Funerary ornaments on horses. In a later related use of the term, the name chaperon passed to certain little shields, or escutcheons, and other funeral devices, placed on the foreheads of horses that drew the hearses to processional funerals. These were called chaperones or chaperons, as they were originally fastened to the chaperonus, or hoods, worn by those horses with their other coverings of state. Gallery.